request from somebody who's listening to the show. I'm a Reading CEO exclusive for specific guests, but today I actually got a request for us to talk to the Emory Center for Ethics. So I am delighted to have on today's show Professor Paul Root Wolpe, their executive director, and Professor Ed Queen, who is their head of their leadership programs. So, gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Tell us first, before we even get started with the substantive part of the conversations, what does a Center for Ethics actually do?
Well, Center for Ethics do different things depending which Center for Ethics it is. Ours is unique. It's one of the largest in the country. It's very multifaceted. We have a very large bioethics program. Most centers in the United States that deal with ethics are medicine and life science ethics centers because that's where all the money is in ethics these days. But we also do ethics. We have an incredible ethics in the arts program. We do leadership training under Edward and servant leadership training. We have programs we have a big AI conference today and tomorrow. We do programs in business, law, ethics of sport, journalism. We can look into the ethics of things that go on around us in current events.
Great. So, as we always love to start our show, what are the things about ethics and trends in ethics that you think mid-market CEOs need to be paying attention to right now?
Well, I think there are two general questions about that. One is, what's the general ethical knowledge that someone in business needs to have? What kinds of skills do they need to have in ethical decision making? So there's the general question. It's our view that people in business don't get enough ethics training because they have to make ethical decisions almost every day, and they can hone their ability to do that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, first is just really being attuned to kind of the questions out there, the needs out there. But the other is really what's going on with emerging issues, everything from AI, data privacy, to dealing with the demands of a short-term ROI when it may distort your decision making in really serious ways.
Well, okay, so we may go on a little detour before we get to the trends question. So it sounds to me like you're saying that people can become more ethical. And that runs contrary to what you hear a lot of the time, that leopards don't change its spots and people's character is kind of, set after, they're teenagers. But you're saying that people can become more ethical.
I don't like to use the term that people become ethical or are ethical. I like to think of people as behaving ethically. And yes, people can learn to behave more ethically, whatever their general inclination is. Ethical behavior is a skill build kind of thing. You can learn how to make ethical decisions. You can learn how to recognize ethical issues when they arise. I think one of the things people don't understand about ethics is it isn't always obvious either what is an ethical issue or what part of a decision you have to make is the ethical part. And what Edward and I try to do in our training is teach people to recognize an ethical issue or to recognize what element of this complex decision is the ethical element, so you can take it out and look at it and then solve it in a productive way. And that's what I mean by ethical behavior or ethical decision making. And I'm not sure people are innately ethical or unethical.
That's really deep. Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I want to kind of talk about in terms of the business issue, that adults conform to their moral environment. And if you're a kind of...
that's a big statement. What does that mean?
That means, look, think about it. If you belong to a group, you tend to conform to the norms, behaviors, practices, interests of that group, right? And if you're in a corporate culture...
At least I pretend to.
Right, well, that's close enough, I mean... but you think about...
Who knows what I'm doing in my office when the door's closed, but, I'll pretend.
Right, but you're in the corporate culture. I mean, if there's one where people are constantly incentivizing you to cut corners, people don't really care, people don't call you on the carpet, things go down. But if you're in a corporate culture where the expectations are high, people tend to kind of rise to those expectations or they leave. I mean, now clearly you're always going to get the bad apples. You always get the tail ends of the bell curve. But we're really talking about the generalized. And so the role of the CEO and the C-suite in ensuring the creation and maintenance of an ethical culture is also another way to think about incentivizing and creating ethical behavior in the people in the organization.
And that has to trickle all the way down. I like to tell the story of when I was in Philadelphia, where I spent most of my career. We did a lot of training in our Masters of Bioethics program with drug reps, because Philadelphia has a lot of drug companies around there. And the story we got time after time was, yes, our CEO and our executives, they talk about ethics. They send ethics memos down. There's a lot of discussion about the ethics of pharma in our company. But my manager tells me, fulfill your quota or you're fired. And so there's a place in the downward flow of ethical messages where somehow it got stuck. And another thing that our center does, that Edward and I do, is we come in and we analyze the ethical culture of a place and try to see, are there those places where the ethical messages are being blocked? Is there a way to report ethics back up the chain to the C-suite? So it is both a cultural thing, as Edward was saying, and it's a structural thing in how you build ethics into your business.
Right. All right. So talk to us about what are some of the ethical problems that you would counsel our CEOs to be paying attention to.
I mean, just to kind of build on what Professor Wolpe was saying at the end there, I think one is you have to look at, do you have policies that really incentivize bad behavior? That kind of create situations where you encourage either implicitly or explicitly people to cut corners. And a perfect example would be the Wells Fargo situation, where the demands on what people produced basically created an incentive for individuals to engage in bad behavior.
Or the cheating scandal with the schools
with APS.
Yeah, Atlanta public schools for people outside of the
which consumed large sections of my time for a couple of years. So does your incentive, do your policies really encourage people to behave badly? Do you make it easy for people to do the right thing, to communicate both kind of concerns about practices, but also to ask questions about, what should I do here? So is there a culture of trust? Is there a culture where people feel like they can ask the question about, hey, I'm concerned about this issue, what should I do? Without having to worry about people thinking they're incompetent, they don't know their job, or just, hey, look, as long as you're successful in bringing in the cash, we're not going to look too closely.
And some of the innate problems of almost all businesses, or many businesses, are, for example, stakeholder conflict. So if you're a public business, you have shareholders, you have employees, you have customers, you have vendors and suppliers, you have many, many outside agencies or agents that are contributing to your business. And very often the needs or the service of two of them come into conflict in some way. And balancing stakeholder interests is a very complex negotiation that every business that has multiple stakeholders has to go through. And there are profound ethical implications of that in how you handle that. Or one other example is I worked a little bit with Coke around their water issues. So they were building a plant in northern India, and it was a plant that was going to employ thousands of people, at least in terms of their economic impact on a very poor region. But it was going to use a significant amount of groundwater in a place that didn't have a lot of extra groundwater. So they had to do the ethical calculation of what is the value of the economic impact versus the natural resources that we're going to have to monopolize to some degree. So those are the kind of complex ethical calculations and decisions that businesses have to make.
Well, I realize now my ignorance, and hopefully listeners will not think badly of me, but I realize I don't know what ethics actually is. And I'm like, I thought it was doing the right thing and doing what they told me in church. That's what being ethical is. But now I'm realizing maybe that's not quite what it is.
Well, it's very brave of you to say that. Most people don't admit that, but I think that that's generally true. So the way I like to talk about it is this: we're taught very young that ethics is about what's right and wrong, and that's true when we're very young. But as we mature and as we engage the complex world, we begin to realize that ethics isn't just about right and wrong, and there's still right and wrong decisions we make. But as adults, the vast majority of ethical problems that confront us are two values in conflict. It's two right things in conflict. So in the example I gave about Coke, it's good to bring economic value to a region, and it's good to come in and
be a steward of the environment.
And these two things are in conflict right now. And that's the way it is with most complex ethical decisions. I spent a lot of time teaching physicians and most of my career been teaching medical students. And the cases we give them are always conflicts in values. It's not about a right and a wrong. This patient wants to do this particular thing. The doctor doesn't think it's in their best interest. Which value, patient autonomy or doctor's responsibility to do what's in the best interest of patients, which of those two values should dominate in this particular case, or how do we compromise the two values? And once you realize that most ethical arguments and conversations are about coming from different value assumptions, you stop with the I'm right and you're wrong language, and you begin to realize that there's a real deep conversation that can be had.
So take us through an example of like a CEO. You're saying that CEOs deal with ethical considerations. And I don't know if you want to take this. They deal with ethical situations every day. And part of it is realizing that it's an ethical decision, ethical thing, and then working it out. Can you give us an example of like somebody's like something that they didn't know was an ethical problem and how they worked it out?
Oh God. I think just kind of one that's really basic is when you're facing kind of corporate layoffs. Having to lay people off is a negative. It's bad for their lives. On the other hand, you've got the question of is the failure to do this going to kind of destroy the company and kind of destroy the lives of everybody you're not laying off? I mean, there are tensions there.
Can I just interject something there? I came to Emory in 2008, and much to his credit, if you remember, fall of 2008 wasn't a good time in our country. I came in just as the housing market crashed, and Emory was, like many universities, very worried about their economic status, and they were thinking they may have to lay people off or at least encourage people into early retirement. I get a call from the president. I had been there just a short time. He called me to his office. He handed me an article from, I think it was Administrative Quarterly, that was called The Ethics of Layoffs, which he had yellow lined throughout. And he sat me down, and for an hour, we discussed how to ethically lay people off in a complex organization. Now, that's a CEO who gets that that's an ethical issue, and the ethics of it need to be made explicit and discussed, much to his credit. And luckily, they didn't end up having to lay people off, but that's just an illustration of what Edward's talking about.
Yeah, and Paul's story also kind of illustrates a different component of kind of ethical action. And really, when we're talking about ethics for us, it's really about what do you do? And there's a difference between the what, I may have to lay people off, but there's also the ethics of how you do it. And, and I think that's really a key consideration as people move through the thing is, I may have to make a very difficult decision, but there's also ethical implications about how I do it.
Mm-hmm.
Do I give people time? Do I kind of plan it? How do I make these decisions and how do I implement them? Have lots of ethical elements within them. And I think that's one of the things that I struggle with in teaching my students is that, this is you have to do X, but the fact that you have to do X doesn't yet get to us to how you do it in a way that, as Paul says, you often have to kind of negotiate lots of different goods, lots of different values in the process of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Let me give you another example to illustrate Edward's point. So we did some consultation with the company, and this company started small, and they started with a very strong values-based service that they wanted to give. They grew to be very, very big in a relatively short time. And they realized at some point that they had hundreds of thousands, if not millions of customers. And they had a lot of data on those customers, which gave them a unique data set that no one else had. So the executives began to think, how could we leverage this data set? Should we sell it? Should we aggregate, pieces of it?
This sounds really familiar. Right. Like we've been hearing about this in the news quite a bit.
And can we do it ethically? But what ended up happening was that their employees, especially those who had been there from the beginning or close to the beginning, had joined this company because of the values propositions that the company represented at the beginning. And these were very talented people who could have joined a lot of other companies. And they began to rebel and say, you can't sell this data. That was never part of the contract with our customers or the contract you had with your employees about why we were here. And that became a values conflict within the company. So there's values conflicts with the company and external stakeholders, and then this was a values conflict in the company within the company itself as it tried to forge its way towards a new future.
So we talk a lot about culture on the show. And I'm wondering what you said something around an ethical culture. What does that actually mean? What does that look like?
Well, I'm a sociologist, so I'm trained in social science and seeing social relationships. So it is about. It's really about communication and modeling. I think those are the two most important elements of developing an ethical culture. The first is, what messages do you send down? By the way, this is as true of parents as it is of CEOs, right? I mean, what do you tell your kids about correct behavior? And then what do you do to show them that that's, in fact, that you walk the walk? You don't just talk the talk. And you can't have conflict between your behavior and your language.
Oh, you can.
Oh, you can, but I mean, you can't to develop an ethical culture.
And far too often people do.
You
Right.
can.
Of course. I mean, you can't if you want to develop a truly ethical culture, because people have very sensitive antennae to hypocrisy. They really do. And as soon as they see even a hint of it, they think most bets are off, right? So, one of the things about ethics that I think is really important to understand is that ethics isn't for sissies. I mean, to really hold an
That's a good
ethical
tweetable
line.
quote.
Yeah, tweetable quote. To really hold an ethical line, it's sometimes you have to make really tough decisions, and you have to do things that are against other interests. And you have to stand up for principle at times when it might be the expedient thing to do, to drop principle and make a profit. And those that do it, though, especially over time, are the people we admire. They're the people that end up being sort of the elder statesmen of our society or of our business world, who rise above the pack because they are known as having integrity. But integrity isn't something you get in a day or a week or a year. It's a life of living in accord with your values.
Do you want to comment on that?
And yeah, I want to kind of start really where Paul did, but in the different directions. One of the ways you have the struggle to create an ethical culture, first of all, has to behave in a way that the people in your organization actually trust you, that they actually believe you mean what you say. We're hardwired for survival, and we all know that the difference between your expressed values and what you really want me to do. And I think that's why modeling is important. But the model, you have to kind of overcome this kind of inherent distrust that so many people have, because unfortunately, many of us have kind of grown up in this punitive environment, right? I mean, why is it when your boss says, "I want to see you in my office," your first thought isn't, "Oh boy, she's going to give me a pony." It's what did I do wrong? And if we want people to do the right thing, why don't we spend as much time rewarding, encouraging, and talking about the right thing as we do about when people do the wrong thing, whether it's a mistake
or even just defining what the right thing is?
Yeah. But, and so you can talk about that. But, what are our corporate values? And you lay them out, you explain them, you model them day to day, and you communicate it, and I think that becomes important. I mean, the ethical companies are those that actually talk about their values. They actually highlight places where people do it. They reward people for making the hard decision because it was the right thing. And I want to go back to your kind of question about the corporate culture. One of the perfect examples is the Panama Canal Corporation. Exists in a relatively corrupt country. You go back and look at where it falls on the list. But because it's created this environment that has a particular set of values, this is how you behave, this is what you do, it's constantly reinforced, it's consistently listed as one of the world's most ethical companies. And that also gets back to my point that adults conform to their moral environment. Yeah, outside the world may be corrupt, outside the world may be dealing payoffs, but if you're going to be part of us, this is what you have to be, this is how you have to act, and this is part of our identity as a corporation, as a culture, and this is what it means to be us.
Listeners, we're talking to the Emory Center for Ethics, Professor Paul Wolpe and Professor Ed Queen. Wow, this is really great. So there were two other things that I would love to talk about. One is what happens when there's an ethical failure. And I'm sure failure is a part of the process. And so how do companies, both individuals and companies, recover from an ethical failure? And what do you think is the state of ethics in general, in business and in the world? Because people are, I know that little hypocrisy meter is going off as people are listening to this show.
Right.
So which of those you want to take first?
Well, there are different kinds of ethical failures. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to how to deal with ethical failures. Sometimes an ethical failure is a long-term descent into, an ethical quagmire, and other times it's just a really bad decision that someone made. But there are some elements in common. The first, I believe, is complete transparency. The tendency to want to hide and cover up, and it's a very human tendency. Look at any 4-year-old that ate the candy, right? It's all over their face. The chocolate's all over their face, and they say, "No, I didn't eat the candy." It's a very human tendency, but it is exactly the wrong thing to do in the case of ethical crisis, because what you're trying to do is restore people's faith in your ethical sensibilities. And if you are covering and hiding and denying, you're doing exactly the opposite, and you're just making it more difficult.
And people have really sensitive hypocrisy meters.
Exactly. And this is a problem in business. It's a problem everywhere. It's a problem in medicine. I mean, we spend a lot of time trying to convince doctors that if you make a mistake, just admit you make a mistake. And what you find, according to the research, is that doctors that admit they made mistakes are sued at, 1/10 the rate at doctors that try to cover it up. But it's very, very hard to convince people that, and it's especially hard to convince legal counsel that that's the right way to do it. And so that is, I think, one of the important things. Admit the mistake, be transparent about the mistake, and then talk about ways that you can make restitution and change the corporate culture. I worked for many, many years as the bioethicist for NASA. And if you remember the Challenger disaster, the organizational cause of the Challenger disaster was really tough problems getting messages up the command chain. And then over a decade later, you had the Columbia disaster. And at base, the Columbia disaster, by the way, after Challenger, they decided they had to change the corporate culture at NASA. It was too hierarchical. It was too sort of militarily influenced, because a lot of people were ex-military. And they spent a lot of time and effort trying to do it. And then the Columbia disaster happened for almost exactly the same reason. And so changing institutional culture is really, really tough. But this is the moment when you can do it. Crisis is a great time for change. And crisis is a great time for self-reflection and reaffirming values. So you have to see crisis as an opportunity.
Yeah, I definitely think that's right. And again, I want to kind of reemphasize Paul's point, is that they're different issues. So let's take VW, Volkswagen. I mean, clearly there was a systemic problem. I mean, not one person said, "Oh, I'm just going to change this computer chip and it's going to cheat." I mean, there were lots of people involved, and you have to assume that one, there was a culture that did not allow people or encourage people to kind of communicate problems. So there you have to kind of say, all right, we've done this, we've got to clean house. We've got to change the culture. I mean, differently. But then there are actually problems or mistakes that in and of themselves aren't your problem. They aren't your ethical decision. And the big classic one is the Tylenol tampering case, where Tylenol discovers that on drugstores that people have been going in and kind of putting poison in Tylenol. And Tylenol could have said, well, we didn't do it, da-da-da. But the CEO kind of stepped forward, said, look, we're concerned about our product. We're concerned about the public. We're going to pull all of them off the shelves and move forward, right? They didn't do anything wrong. But in a challenging environment, the CEO stepped forward and said, we're going to do the right thing because we know that our duty in this situation is to the public and to the public's health. So there's a difference between a kind of systemic problem and a problem you inherit because of somebody else did. But what you do is to some extent the same thing. As Paul said, you've got to be transparent. You've got to step forward. You've got to get out in front of it. And you've got to admit, we really want to make this better. But you also have to convince the people you're taking the steps to do that.
And the question around the state of ethics, and I imagine that's probably why the listener wanted me to have you on the show, is to talk about, like, things don't seem very ethical right
Right.
now. There seems to be a fair amount of hypocrisy all over the place right now.
Well, first of all, we should say that this is a perennial complaint. So I used to give my students a quote, and it said, kids today, they don't listen to their parents, and they're off playing when they should be studying, and they don't take work seriously, and they're really a kind of generation that doesn't adhere to the values of their parents. And they read that, and I asked them who they think wrote it, and they guess all kinds of peers, and it was Plato. So this is nothing new. This idea that there are ethical challenges, and many, many, many times in history has seen it as the worst possible time. Right? It's the best of times. It's the worst of times. Yes, we have a particular set of ethical challenges in our culture right now, especially in our political culture, which everyone knows about. I don't really think this is a particularly ethically challenging time in industry. If you look at where industry is now, if you look at its environmental concerns, and we now have VPs of sustainability all over the place. If you look at things like minorities and women in the workplace, if you look at many of the things that really were challenging to business 30, 40 years ago, they're still challenges, of course, and they're not perfect, but we've made enormous strides. The interesting thing about ethics is you tend to focus on the challenges rather than the accomplishments. And if you look at the ethics of business today, in many ways, it's much, much better than it has been in certain times in the past. But we tend to focus on the challenges.
Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, as Paul said, he's trained as a sociologist. I'm trained as an historian. As I say, the great thing about being an historian is that no matter what comes up, you get to look down your nose over your glasses and say it really isn't new, Yeah, I mean, I think it's like anything else. It's a mixed bag. I mean, and Paul clearly acknowledged some of the areas where there've been tremendous strides. I mean, you look at where the country was 50, 60 years ago in terms of women's equality, in terms of racial issues. There things have moved forward. But there remain the challenges, and I think one of the biggest ones for business, and I think one of the biggest ones currently for culture, for society, is that this question about how we value people, and also how we value a company. The kind of overemphasis on return on investment in terms of kind of short-term quarterly growth is an emphasis that kind of really encourages incentives for short-term thinking, and therefore incentives to cut ethical corners. And I mean, there's been a shift in that, but it still perdures, and the people that are teaching in business school are the people that kind of got educated thinking that that's what's going on, but that shift's going on. And the other is really, what happens when you live in a society, again, where the only way we can really think about an individual's values if we monetize it. And
wow, that's deep.
And so if I got more money than you are, I have value. And
I have more value than you do.
I'm worth more, right? Yeah, you may have $1 billion, but you probably may not be worth a damn. But sorry, I say that on the radio. But and I think one of the things, back to politics, I think we're really starting to see this manifest itself in gross ways within lobbying. I mean, the lobbying organizations are kind of shilling for despots and murderers, basically because they're paying my company $300,000, $850,000 a month. Right. So a few people are dead, and who cares? So I think there's a kind of cultural impetus that really is disturbing, and people have to realize that maybe sometimes my value's not really contingent upon what I get, but it's really contingent upon what I do.
Wow. So I have had this question for a long time, and I didn't know that it was going to come up. So I'm going to put the historian thing back on you. This thing about valuing people based on, how much money they have, that's pretty ancient too, right?
Yeah.
That was, way before Plato.
Right.
So what does a society, or what does one do? Because that is it, right? We value people, humans value people, whether or not you're in kind of a society in Africa, you have the big chief who has the whatever and the however many wives, and you have the big chief in Washington who has however many women behind him too, because of his money. So what's the deal?
I think there's two things, and you're right. I mean, money and power, people have always been trying to accumulate and grab, but I think, and again, since his name's been in the press so much lately, I'll go ahead and reference him. George Soros actually studied with Karl Popper, a British philosopher, but Soros wrote a piece probably 27 years ago, where he said the problem isn't that impetus isn't there. The problem is it's become the only moral language we have. So in the past, there have been competing moral languages, and people struggled about it, and we went different way. I think the challenge that kind of, I will argue, is beginning to permeate the culture is we don't have alternative visions about what it means to be a person of value, what it means to be a good person. And those are kind of being lost in the language. And
if you look at the younger generation of millennials, their sort of vision of their future very often is start a new startup, make a lot of money, sell it, and be a millionaire in my 20s. And we haven't talked about technology, but technology has been an important part of the modern cultural view of both power and influence and service also. And technology is always a mixed game. Technology always creates new challenges, which we then try to create new technologies to solve, which then create new challenges. So we need new technologies, which is why we always seem to have too much technology and not enough technology at the same time. What modern technologies do, whether they are apps or whether they're artificial intelligence, is they distance people from each other to some degree. And that can be done in a healthy way, or that can be done in an unhealthy way. And so when you begin to look at the modern culture, I mean, Edward's point about money being the only language we have now to instill value, I think there's a counter trend to that, socially responsible investing and apps as service and things like that. And part of what we need to do in the business community and as citizens is begin to really encourage that more socially positive, pro-social view of what business can do.
And yet, I wonder and think about whether or not that's just going to devolve into hypocrisy as well. Because you can say as much as you want to say that people should look at a school teacher the same way that they, who makes $50,000 or whatever $1,000 a year, the same as a CEO who makes $50 million a year. Like, how likely is that going to happen in America? Like, is that really going to happen in America ever?
It doesn't really happen anywhere. I mean, but there's a reason for that, and that is that money is a symbolic power. That's what money is. It is something that gives you the ability to accumulate resources, and what power is in the human species is the ability to accumulate resources, whether those resources are material resources or whether they're cultural resources like influence. And money is what we've come up with as the symbolic surrogate for power itself. And so,
wow.
So when we use money as our sole source of measuring that power, that's what Edward's talking about, and that's when we're in trouble. There are many, many other examples of that. Other ways to influence. There's a story told about Mother Teresa. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, where Mother Teresa was washing the feet of lepers. And this woman from the West was visiting, and she stopped and she watched her do that. And she said, "I can't believe it. I wouldn't do that for $1 million. And Mother Teresa looked at her and said, "Neither would I." And, she was using a different yardstick of what influence was, of what value. She was a very influential person that had, that was not a wealthy person. And so part of the question is, what is the yardstick you use for value? And I do think that there are some counter trends to what Edward's talking about, where money and that kind of power become the only way we think about what makes life worth living for people.
Great. Well, listeners, we're out of time. I've been talking to the Emory Center of Ethics, Professor Paul Root Wolpe, their executive director, and their Head of Leadership Programs, Professor Ed Queen. Gentlemen, thank you for a great show.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks.
So if people want to get in touch with you to hear more about anything that they've heard on today's show, how can they do that?
They can certainly, we're on the web. Just find Emory Center for Ethics, ethics.emory.edu, or give us a call. We do have lots of extraordinary programs, and we have degree programs, and we have programs we do for the public. Great speakers we bring in. Come and visit.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. And Sister Helen Prejean will be talking about Atlanta Opera's Dead Man Walking in mid-January. So come and hear her.
Very good. Listeners, you've been listening to CEO Exclusive. My name is Sohini Koch, and I hope you have a prosperous, productive, and very profitable week. Thanks.
This show is brought to you by Anona Enterprises, where strategy is your access to money and performance. Learn more at AnonaEnterprises.com.